So we'll get started. Hello and welcome to session 3 of our approaching the new year through an exploration of Shmita and the meaning of the sabbatical year. This year that is going to be beginning in less than 2 weeks is going to be a Shmita year. And in the course of our studies from the past 2 weeks, we've begun to explore at least the hypothetical implications of that on a societal scale. In our discussion this evening, we are going to be maybe exploring what this might mean for us. And I was gonna say, in this wrap-up session, but I suspect that we won't really be wrapping anything up. And I give us all permission to leave Shmita not satisfyingly wrapped up. That will be okay. So we are, as usual, going to go into the base biblical sources. We're going to explore them a little bit more than we have in the previous weeks. And then we'll pause and consider how they're landing with us this evening. And then we are going to look at a few other sources that speak to how we might think about Shmita for ourselves individually or in our contemporary context. We'll think with each other about this. And I have a song on YouTube to share with you all. So I hope it'll be fun. Okay, my friends, let's dive into these sources. Again, for those who joined a few minutes later, the source sheet is shared in the chat, but I will also share screen for us to study together. So I invite you, if you haven't made the bracha already today, to join me in the bracha for Torah study. Baruch atah Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. Can I have a volunteer to read this first text? We keep coming back to it. It's the first time Shmita is mentioned in Torah in the book of Exodus. Howard, since you are unmuted, would you be willing?
Oh, yeah, sure. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and that your bondman and stranger may be refreshed.
Thank you for reading, and reading nice and slowly so we could take that in. So that is Shmita mention number 1 biblically. Can I have a volunteer to read the second source mentioning it from Leviticus 25? Thank you,
Sure,
Carol.
I will. God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, telling him to speak to the Israelites and say to them, "When you come to the land that I am giving you, the land must be given a rest period, a Sabbath to God. For 6 years you may plant your fields, prune your vineyards, and harvest your crops. But the 7th year is a Shabbat of Shabbats for the land. It is God's Sabbath, during which you may not plant your fields nor prune your vineyards. Do not harvest crops that grow on their own, and do not gather the grapes on your unpruned vines, since it is a year of rest for the land. What grows while the land is resting may be eaten by you, by your male and female slaves, and by the employees and resident hands who live with you. All the crops shall be eaten by the domestic and wild animals that are in your land."
find that a bit contradictory.
Mhm.
I don't understand that you do not harvest crops that grow on their own, but then you can eat.
Oh, great. So Oriana was not with us last week. Does someone who remembers the Rambam and the Rashi on this want to explain what the mainstream opinion in the source, how the mainstream opinion in the sources deals with this seeming contradiction?
I believe it was that you can eat, but you can't harvest. You can take in your hand, or what you can put in your pocket, but that is, you can't gather. Am I wrong there?
Also, Oriana, I think they differentiated that harvest was kind of like the normal or typical work to maybe even earn some proceeds on your land, right? So there was a differentiation with that versus eating what you needed, right? That to sustain your life and the lives of the people with you.
Yes. So those of you who have been in this class will forgive my multiple iterations on this theme, but I was on a walk with a friend yesterday in Amazon. This was actually South University neighborhood, and we passed a house that had a pear tree dangling over the sidewalk, and we each picked a pear and we noshed on it. And then on our way home, we passed a house that had a plum tree, and we each picked a plum and we noshed on the plums on our way home. And so there is a form of eating of that is not an assertion of ownership or a claiming. And then there is a form of, and the commentators presume that harvest is asserting ownership and claiming the totality of the land's yield. So yes, Howard and Rebecca, what you just said were both correct. Oriana, do you feel resolved?
Yeah, thank you. I just have this vision in my mind in Nachlaot in Jerusalem on Rehov Beersheva of there being a garden where it's open for people to come and take during Shmita. And so that's why I sort of like, what? You're not supposed to harvest? But now I get it. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. They say, Maimonides says more explicitly, you have to treat all produce as if it is hefker, as if it is ownerless, meaning equally accessible to all and available to none to stake a total claim. So we are going to move on to the third source, which adds the interesting social dimension. Can I have a volunteer to read this one?
Sure. At the end of every 7 years, you shall celebrate the remission year. The idea of the remission year is that every creditor shall remit any debt owed by a neighbor and sibling when God's remission year comes around. You may collect from the alien, but if you have any claim against your kin for a debt, you must relinquish it. If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinfolk in any of your settlements in the land that Hashem your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinfolk. Rather, you must open your hand and lend them sufficient for whatever they need. Beware lest you harbor the base thought, oh, the 7th year, the year of remission is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinfolk and give them nothing. They will cry out to Hashem against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to them readily, and let your heart not fear when you do so. For in return, Hashem your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that beautifully dramatic reading. And so those of us in the session last week on the social implications of Shmita, discussed the reality of the Prose Bowl, the fact that in the Mishnah, back in the Second Temple period, Rabbi Hillel observed that in fact, the wealthy were in violation of this mitzvah in Deuteronomy, not specifically the mitzvah of remitting debt, but the mitzvah, beware lest you harbor a base thought and you fail to lend your kinsman anything. The wealthy were dealing with Shmita by refusing to make any loans in advance of the Shmita year. And so Hillel enacted a Prose Bowl to turn the debt over. A Prose Bowl is a word for document that allowed the creditor to turn the debt over to the Beit Din, which would have the authority to still collect it during the Shmita year, and then name and presumably pay the creditor as an agent on behalf of the Beit Din to collect the debt. So we know, we've studied in the past few weeks that Shmita is very difficult, right? We studied the first week, the Rashi commentary about how the first exile after the destruction of the first temple was making up for 70 years that the Israelites failed to observe Shmita and Yovel in the Jubilee, and the exile, and 70 years was the amount of Shmita and Yovel that they should have observed, meaning the implication being that the Israelites never observed Shmita or Yovel the first time around in the land. After the first exile, they presumably started taking Shmita more seriously, or at least seriously enough that the creditors weren't making loans because they were afraid of what would happen if they had to forgive them. So, we know Shmita is logistically very, very hard. I don't know quite everybody who is here, but the people I know are attending from the diaspora. We live outside of the land of Israel. Our land holdings, with the possible exception of Oriana, are all outside of the land of Israel. And so Shmita does not practically apply to us, which gives us a lot of freedom, actually, to think about the spiritual implications of this biblical mandate. So not just what does Shmita ask of farmers in Israel? What does Shmita ask of creditors in the land of Israel? But if we look at these laws as speaking to some deep need for individuals and societies, what does Shmita ask of us? So I'm going to encourage you to think about that with a partner. I'm going to break us into breakout rooms of 2 or 3 people and encourage you to discuss with each other for about 5 minutes. And then I'll pull us back together. And those of you who don't mind having your answers recorded can share some of your insights before we go on to what some other contemporary thinkers hypothesize that Shmita might demand of us. So give me a moment and I will prepare the breakout rooms. And we'll go for it. You should all have an invitation to join and discuss. Welcome back, friends. And based on how many of you showed up only when the clock ran down, I presume that you were all engaged in very interesting conversations. Would any of you like to, oh yes, good modeling. Feel free to use the chat to thank your partner or share one last thought, either publicly or a private chat just to your partner. Those will not be visible on YouTube. And if anyone would like to share an insight that came up or a question or challenge that came up from your time together, I'd love to hear them.
One thing that I thought, Rabbi, is this progressiveness of becoming a more liberal person. You know, it's like you start out with the corners of your field, letting people come in and eat off the corners, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're walking through your fields and they're picking stuff. You know, and just the integration of that just seems like you have to grow as a person more, I think, in the journey of this thing, you know. And as you go towards Yuval, you know, I think it's just that it's like, well, it's not only are you supposed to forgive this, but you're supposed to, you know, just let it all go. And so, anyway.
Yes, it's a radical, different understanding of boundaries, at least physical boundaries, and how we use physical boundaries to keep us feeling safe and secure.
And it certainly points out our, you know, maybe it develops, maybe it doesn't, our sense of generosity. And it shows us, I think, you know, where our boundary and generosity exists. We don't necessarily have a farm, but in other ways, how to be more generous.
Mm-hmm. Or at least how to very much stretch our comfort zones around generosity.
Yeah.
Yes, Patty, please.
So I had the pleasure of meeting Howard in my breakout room, and the conversation, that wasn't supposed to be secret, was it?
No.
I assumed it was somewhat randomly assigned. At any rate, I was able to take the concept anyways and apply it to the farmers and the organic farmers and those that know how to leave their, you know, certain fields fallow. And I think that on some level, they may not be doing it in the 7th year, although there's probably some science behind that is being practiced. And I don't know if anyone knows, but I think this does speak to the science of how we were supposed to treat the earth. And some people are practicing it.
Yes. Well, yes and no. It's an interesting question. The Jewish farmers I know who have studied Shmita have taught, to be honest, I'm not sure based on what, but I haven't closely studied the Mishnahs about this, that ancient Israelite agriculture did tend to go on a 3-year crop rotation. So, you know, our ancestors knew about fallowing and companion planting and, you know, renewing the soil. And Shmita is something different. Shmita, you know, those practices sustain and increase the land's productivity for human benefit. It's a shame Marjorie Feldman isn't here with us tonight. She's been with some of the other sessions, but as a vintner, as someone who runs a vineyard, she has spoken to us before about how terrible the practice of Shmita would be from a human perspective. Just letting your vines get overrun without any pruning, without any weeding. And there is something, you know, if we read closely about Shmita, it is actually not entirely, it's not entirely about increasing productivity for the long haul. And it is, in fact, perhaps undermining the notion that every form of rest should increase productivity. Maybe there are forms of rest that have some other value than increasing productivity. So I don't know if contemporary farmers practice Shmita, which is something different than, you know, a rotation of fallowing and something from a productivity oriented perspective, much harder and much harder to justify than, you know, crop rotation and periodic fallowing. Go ahead, Sophia.
It really struck me how Shmita sort of demands a reassessment of what we think of as normal in society. And I was thinking about how it would be really cool to see that come out in the modern world. And then I realized that that's what we're seeing with COVID and nothing's happening. But I wonder how much of that is because COVID is born out of this like deep universal trauma, and Shmita comes from a place of joy and rest. And I think my instinct is to draw a parallel because COVID was sort of this great pause. And yet in form, they can look similar, but I think their result is so different because of the source of where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
Very thoughtful.
Yes. Okay, lots of people have thoughts about this. Chris, and then Christina, and then Philip. And then we're gonna, I think, look at some other sources that segues nicely to.
Well, one thing that I was thinking about a lot over the past couple of weeks, and then also in our discussion with Sophia, was the comparison between Shabbat and Shmita, which is in the text. But it compares Shmita to a Shabbat, but then can you do it the other way? And is there any implication of trying to incorporate the sort of the spirit of Shmita with Shabbat every week, and making it less about maybe individuals and households and more about everyone in the land and all of those things? Is that something you can get out of that or not? So that's sort of one thing I've been pondering a while.
Yes, great question. I think the answer is yes, but I want to hand the discussion on to other people. Christina, go ahead.
I was thinking about the last few months. I've been going through something that I won't mention here, but this class has kind of triggered a different awareness with me, because food, when you remove food from its source, things start to happen chemically to it. And those different things, in my particular situation, they can end up being migraine triggers. And I understand that they can also cause health problems for other people when these chemicals kind of build up in nuts and fruits and things after they've been removed from the tree, and they kind of continue to go on through their journey of aging. These chemicals increase. And so it's been the idea of just kind of eating very fresh, and the lack of preservation that would have been happening because you can't harvest. So, we're such a preservation society where we store food, and then quite frankly, I think a lot of us probably end up wasting about 20% or 25% of that stored food, to be very frank with you. I know that I am guilty of those things. I kind of hoard it, and you think, oh, I'll eat that when I want to, or oh, it's there for an emergency or whatever. And then you've had other things, and you look at the date and like, oh well, okay, now this is ruined, and I wasted the money. But more importantly, I wasted the resource that could have been used for somebody else. And it sat there on my shelf. I didn't get it to the pantry. I didn't, and I know if I do that, everybody else probably does that on some sort of a level too, unfortunately.
I suspect a lot of us are in your boat, Christina, and I will be vulnerable and say I have like mountains of pears in various states of ripe to rot on my counter right now. And I comfort myself saying these are pears gleaned from trees that I know no one else is harvesting and that would just fall on the ground and rot if I didn't harvest them. So I don't feel a huge amount of pressure.
But maybe a human wouldn't eat it, right? But all these animals.
Well, and also what Shmita does is implicitly require us to create the systems of distribution to get it to people who would eat it quickly before it's rotted. Okay,
so that's just kind of where I've been at, thinking thinking of that, of the food itself.
Yeah.
That's why we all need a compost pile.
It does seem to me that the whole Shmita idea is so much more aimed towards the well-to-do. If you have land and you have orchards and you have vineyards and you have money to lend, Shmita is a big deal to observe. On the other hand, if you're poor and you don't have land and you have debts, it's much less of a burden. So that it's making a big difference depending on who you are, your status.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, Howard, we'll allow one more comment and then we'll move on to some other sources.
This has to do with what Chris was saying, and also this bringing in of other people. Isn't there a tradition, Sabbath evening meal, where you invite strangers in, or people who are traveling in the community, where they're just invited to dinner because it's the Sabbath? This is a kind of a extending the boundaries again, involving more people, and also, but this is also giving up control, in the sense of you're kind of putting yourself in God's hands, let's say, so to speak, at this time, because you're no longer in charge of everything. You're basically putting your hands up and saying, whatever happens now will happen. Those are just a couple of things that came to mind. And this great leveling that Philip was talking about. It's not a great leveling, but it's something of a leveling.
Yes. I think, we've talked about how agriculture is life in Torah. So Torah is presuming that most of it, that it's normative it's normative second person singular that it addresses is a land holding agrarian farmer, much like, Thomas Jefferson's ideal of who Americans would be. And so, I think we should we shouldn't assume that if we don't have orchards, Shmita isn't speaking to us. I think, Shmita isn't just speaking to farmers or the top 1%. Shmita is probably speaking to the top 20% in a society, or the top 40%, in terms of the demands that it makes on us, whether or not we physically have a field, if we're willing to be open to the demand. So I want to turn us to some sources from some contemporary thinkers who make some suggestions about what the demand might be, and invite us to be in conversation with those sources and react to them. So first of all, we're not going to start with that. We're going to start with Muriel Goldsmith, who has been really active in Jewish environmental circles for decades, an active organizer and writer, particularly around climate change. So would someone who hasn't read already like to read Mirila's musings on this? Out loud, ideally.
I can.
How,
Thank you.
Imagine that you're a wealthy landowner in ancient Israel. You know the Shmita sabbatical year is coming and what's required. You must stop planting and let your land lie fallow for the year. You must forego a year of profit. Not only that, over the past few years, you have lent money to your poor neighbors, and now you must forgive their debts so that your neighbors can also let their lands lie fallow. If they were obligated to pay you back, they would not be able to participate. These laws are good for the fertility of the land and for your neighbor's livelihood and dignity. But observing Shmita and putting the community's needs ahead of your own, requires a sacrifice from you. Would you do it? Fast forward to today. You live in one of the world's richest countries and you depend on cheap energy extracted from the earth for your livelihood and your lifestyle. In neighboring countries, though, people are poor. They use little energy and they have little money to invest in new infrastructure. Will you try to use energy more efficiently? Will you invest in renewable energy sources that don't damage the earth? If you will, further warming of the atmosphere will be prevented. Your neighbors, more vulnerable than you because of their poverty, will be protected from rising seas, heat waves, and drought. But caring for their lives requires a sacrifice from you. Will you do it?
Thank you for reading, Sophia. So I think what I appreciate about Mirala's text, though this may have in fact been written a few years ago when the conversation could just be about stopping climate change and not also about mitigating the now inevitable effects. But what I like about this is it turns, I think it very concretely analogizes from this attractive and abstract and applying to other people in other positions ideal into our own kind of inconvenient and difficult reality. So I'm curious if just anyone wants to respond to the question that she raises.
I guess it's a question that I'm always asking. What can I do that would reduce my consumption of fossil fuels or be, tread more lightly on Earth? So her questions are good ones. And would I sacrifice? I do my small bit individually and want to support in ways that I can. Those people can do it in a bigger way. Making corporations be accountable and making legislators holding them responsible, or making changes that will be bigger than my individual contribution to this effort. It's a challenge to try to do it individually.
It's a challenge, and it is a challenge to negotiate the sacrifices. I, for years, intended to stop flying before COVID, not actually my environmental commitment, but COVID made me stop flying. And now I'm really hoping to have the commitment to not go back to it. But certain things are just so dang convenient. Jade and then Chris.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think the Shmita thing and what you were doing just with the pears, Rabbi Ruhi, are actually still taking care of the earth, because if anything that we can glean from right around us locally, we do not have to pay pay as in a global cost of the fossil fuels and everything else to get it from somewhere else to us. Just the act of taking this year and saying, I'm only going to eat local would be a huge radical change. I'm only going to eat in season this year, or, if I already have it stored in my freezer, I guess. But even those things would be a radical change. And I think that to me, when I read the Shmita thing, it's so clear. It's saying that this is about taking care of the earth. This is so far beyond you and I resting, but about we need to take this time to stop and think, what about the earth?
Yeah, thank you, Jade. Chris, go ahead.
I was just thinking about the question that she poses, and that I think the answer is always going to be no. Whatever in people's intentions, I think, I like to buy organic things, but it comes in plastic. So am I doing anything particularly virtuous by, eating pasture raised things or, organic produce that doesn't have pesticides or whatever it may be? I guess I just think, it's a really tall ask. It's a really hard thing to do. And I think that's part of it. It just, there's always something more you could be doing no matter what you are doing. but it's a good goal to have. It's a good thing to shoot for.
May I say that?
Go ahead, Howard.
May I say that it's good to celebrate the small things you do, that we shouldn't look at, oh my God, I can't do the whole thing, so it's no good. It's good to celebrate the small things we do. If we can take that small thing and add a centimeter to it, that's a good thing. It's a good thing.
There's a new-ish, founded in the last few years, Jewish climate advocacy organization that is called Dayenu, as in the word we sing over and over again on Pesach, meaning, it's enough for us. And I believe their ostensible meaning is, we've had enough. It's time to do more work on climate, like enough sitting around. But I also really like an implicit meaning in that title. Like when we recite Dayenu on Pesach, and some of you have heard me teach about this already, what we are doing is celebrating each small step, as incomplete as it is, on the road to liberation. And I agree, Howard, that, despair at the magnitude of the crisis and our own insufficiency to stem it is extraordinarily seductive. And we need to practice. We need to practice living well and noticing how we do. And I think this also gets back to Chris's question about the connection between Shabbat and Shmita. And I will say Yovel. We haven't really talked in this class about Yovel, about Jubilee. It's also introduced in Leviticus 25, which is the second of the texts that we looked at biblically about Shmita. Yovel is the every 50 year after, so Shabbat is a cycle of 7 days. Shmita is a cycle of 7 years. Yovel is the completion of a cycle of 7 Shmitas. So 49 years, 7 times 7. And then the 50th year is Yovel, is Jubilee, when all land reverts to its original owners and all enslaved are free, even if it's before their indenture is up. So I really appreciate this article by Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who's another wonderful contemporary Jewish and ecological thinker. I have, as you can see, taken 3 fairly hefty chunks from it for us to consider, each of which packs its own punch and kind of takes us in a different direction. But Chris, if you'd be willing, I'd like you to read the first of the excerpts up to the first line, because I think it speaks to a little bit to the question you raised earlier.
The effect of this system of spirals of sevens was the periodic renewal of repose in both the physical and institutional spheres. The cycles affirmed the worth of labor and pointed beyond labor to the worth of celebration. The cycles affirmed the worth of efforts to control and use the earth and pointed beyond that effort to the worth of loving the earth. The cycles affirmed the worth of efforts to accumulate wealth and power and pointed beyond that accumulation to the worth of sharing. In these ways, the spirals of renewal taught through constant practice that even the best acts of creation and production and accumulation were not the single goal of human effort. The Sabbath mattered.
Thank you. Let's take a deep breath with that.
That's a lot to sort of, I was trying to think as I was reading it. It was very hard to keep track of.
Yeah, let's just take a moment to take that in, and then I'll ask for a volunteer to read the next excerpt. And I'm sorry if I didn't make it sufficiently clear. When he says the system of spirals of 7, he's talking about Shabbat, Shmita, and Yovel, the Jubilee. May I have a volunteer to read the next excerpt? And I'll just say contextually, he's talking about, okay, so we're not farmers, how might we, if Shmita is meant to be a society-wide thing with society-wide impacts, how might we imagine it in a way that is normative to how we think about production nowadays?
Read. In the world of scientific industrialism, the speed of change is itself constantly accelerative. The engine of that acceleration is technological, research and development, R&D. So suppose we were to stop all research and development for 1 year in every 7. Suppose we were to keep paying the engineers and scientists, but we were to ask them to spend the year in a real sabbatical. We would ask them to meet with each other and with the rest of us to ask some questions. Where is it all heading? What kind of technological development is life-giving and necessary? What kind is destructive and should stop? What unexpected consequences are we discovering with regard to this piece of technology or that one? And suppose that in addition to examining with each other such issues of value, we encouraged our technologists to simply sit and listen, catch their breaths at an ocean shore, in a swamp, on a desert trail, in a cornfield, dancing, drawing, whistling.
Lovely.
Fantastic.
Lovely.
Thank you for reading, Oriana. And let's take another moment to just let that idea sink in. Like I said, it's really worth reading the entire article, but each of these excerpts kind of packs its own punch. All right. Can I have a volunteer to read to us the third excerpt? It's a long one.
Look for a moment at our economic rhythms. Hypothesis that once every 50 years or so, the economy comes to a halt, a grinding halt, or a joyful one. Once every 50 years or so, if there is no redistribution of wealth and power, there is a Great Depression. Why should this be so? Because over an entire generation, if the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, there are more and more troublesome frictional effects. The poor become less able to buy what the institutions are producing, and there emerges a glut of unused productive capacity. The poor become more and more hopeless, apathetic, and sullen, less and less efficient and imaginative workers. And the rich too become less efficient and imaginative because the sheer power of their institutions insulates them against the many, many changes in a changing world. When people want small cars instead of large, GM pays no attention. When people want fewer H-bombs instead of more, Boeing pays no attention. The rich get stuck in their ways. The poor get stuck with the bill. The society gets stuck in its tracks. Result, an economic depression, a depression that has some general social usefulness because it opens up new avenues of creativity and productivity. Some conservatives applaud this as a shakeout. They are right. They are right as far as they go. Now, in an odd way, the Jubilee year would itself be an economic depression. Everybody is unemployed, the whole social apparatus stops. The difference is in the sharing. In a modern depression, the poor suffer terribly, most of the middle class a great deal, and some of the rich may lose their shirts. The burdens are unequal, and the pain of the resting that benefits the whole society is imposed on only some of its members. The Jubilee shares the pain of resting for the short run. There might have been less to eat if for 2 years in a row, no one had sown, cultivated, or reaped, and turns the pain into a communal celebration.
Thanks for reading, Patty.
This still Arthur Waskow?
Yep. Same article, just a different place in the article. It is an excerpt, actually. It's a chapter from one of his books, God Wrestling Part 2. But he's made this available online at the Shalom Center. I think I included the link. Yes. So one could go to that.
So in the Jubilee year, there's a second year in a row of no.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to break us into breakout rooms again, because there's just been a lot, and I imagine we're roiling with thoughts, and in our large group, we don't have capacity to hear everyone's thoughts, but I want to encourage all of your creative ideasing. So I invite you to, respond both to Mirala Goldsmith's comment, but also Rabbi Arthur Waskow's ideas. I've just kind of recapped each of the three in a single sentence. The cycles of Shabbat and Shmita point to a higher value beyond work. We would benefit from a periodic break from the development of new technology, and that economic cycles inevitably include periods of depression. The difference between disaster and joy is how we relate to them and think about them and prepare for them and distribute resources during them. That's just a recap of what he said, but feel free to discuss as creatively or tangentially as you would like. I'm going to break us into new breakout rooms. Yeah?
Yeah.
New partners? Okay. Okay, rooms are open. We'll take 5 minutes. Welcome back, and much empathy to you who have just been cut off mid-sentence. Feel free to continue or close a thought in the chat. So did this give you any creative ideas or challenges? Go ahead, Chris.
Well, the one that I'm stuck on is finding joy in depression, in a depression in any way, and there's so much suffering. And even if something good is happening or coming out of it, all the other things, you think of the Great Depression and all the terrible things that people suffered, how can that, just squaring that. So that's what I was thinking about a lot.
Yes. One of Rabbi Waskow's pieces that I disagree with, he says the difference is the sharing. I think that is one of two major differences. The other difference is the between the economic depression that happens when society goes out of control and the Shmita and Jubilee that the people choose to take on is the empowerment and the ownership of the Shmita and Jubilee. I mean, even if even if presumably we're not choosing because it's our choice, we're doing it, or the ancient Israelites were doing it because Hashem commanded it and they thought they'd be exiled from their land if they didn't. But, it is something we are planning for. It's something that we have, that we're not thinking of as an aberration, but part of, what if we just said, this is going to happen every 50 years and we have to incorporate our understanding of productivity, of the economy, of all the things that we think of as the normal flow of life into this is going to happen every 50 years. How can we do it well? it is boggling. I totally grant you that, from the context we're coming from, it is a boggling question.
I think, Rabbi, what you said was really good, because I think your mind does have to leap. It has to make some kind of leap in order to wrap your head around, well, what would it be like if this happened? Kind of like, I don't know. It's like, the things you read about the future, about lions and lambs laying down together and stuff. It's just like, well, what if you just could put yourself in a mind frame that you started acting as though that were true, or that your mind just could make a leap and you could actually make change.
Yeah. What if we were actually preparing for there to be enough for everyone to go without working for a year? Like, we'd have to ask, enough what?
That's a thought.
Yeah. It would raise the question, well, what is enough? Enough of what?
What do you need?
Ma Diana.
Well done.
Who gets the control distribution?
Yeah, another good question. How do we do this well?
In thinking about what Sophia had said when she was bringing it back to COVID, if you think about the imposed restrictions that we had in terms of, like, all of a sudden the world went topsy-turvy, in the spring of 2020, what people thought they needed and how that all unfolded, kind of the big grabs of, like, food and toilet paper and all that stuff, that wasn't how we do it.
Yes. I don't know if you saw, but one of the sources we haven't looked at on the sheet is an article written. He's actually one of my mentors, Rabbi Fred Sherlinger Daub. I shadowed him when I was in rabbinical school, in part because he's a synagogue rabbi who also has an active environmental advocacy element of his whole career and commitment. And he wrote an article. I didn't excerpt very much of it. It's a little bit dated. It was written in April of 2020, when I think the pandemic felt pretty new and like something, that we hoped might lead to the utopian society, or, might not be that bad. But, and he compared what the pandemic might do to us to Shmita. And I really agree with Sophie's insight and Rebecca's insight. It raises some of the same questions as Shmita, and it hasn't transformed anything. And in part, I'm going to stop share for a minute because I'm realizing I'm not ready to look there. In part, I think it hasn't transformed anything because we, as a collective, have not been interested in transformation. I mean, some of us may have been, but as a collective, we have really mostly resisted the transformation and tried to get back to normal as quickly as possible, or never leave normal, right? Productivity didn't even really take a hit. People worked from home. People worked parents worked all the time. We in very many arenas resisted the idea that this might demand of us that we change the way we relate to each other and the way we live. Rabbi Fred, writing in April of 2020, was sort of suggesting in one particularly concrete way the ways that COVID was manifesting as an anti-Shmita. Maybe someone wants to read this. Maybe Rebecca, you'd be willing.
Sure. Hand sanitizers, masks, and even toilet paper are suddenly hard to come by. Rampant individualism runs amok within a climate of fear. a perfect storm for the ascendance of the Yetzer Hara, evil or selfish impulse. Yet Shmita insists on a sharing economy. In resource-stressed times, everyone gleans freely from whatever sprouts on private property. Once crops are exhausted in the field, homeowners must open their personal pantries and declare all their food public. The deep truth that we are all in this together is rooted in our personal and communal practice.
So very apropos to what you were saying, Rebecca.
Is that true that in Shmita, that when there is nothing left in the crops, that people who had needed to open up their personal homes and pantries?
Yes, it's a halacha of Shmita that is listed in Maimonides' Hilchot, his laws of Shmita and the Jubilee. That and he goes into some detail of giving examples and explaining, but the general principle is, you can gather some food into your home. It's a little bit dicey, as long as it's in the field, maybe, but certainly once the season has passed, if you've got cucumber pickles and there's no more cucumbers on the vine, you got to put your barrel of pickles outside and let anybody take from it.
Of course, we live in a different kind of situation. We're huge. Our towns are huge. Our numbers are huge. I'd say if my neighbor was in need, I would hope that I would help my neighbor. My neighbor could be the guy next to me. It could be the woman on the other side. It could be two people down the road. I would hope we would help each other. And indeed we do. So a transformation, a communal transformation. I think if we make individual transformations, that's a big deal. That's a big deal.
I have a question too. Is if we our dependency upon a government, does that keeping us and from this moral obligation do we have with our neighbors or with our people around us or something? Does that impede that because the need isn't as great, or somebody else will take care
Certainly,
of it?
that's what I've heard some libertarians argue. But I don't mean that as a flip answer. I think in some ways, both of the points that each of you just brought up, Howard and Ron, point to another question that Shmita encourages us to ask, right? Not just what is enough and enough of what, but who's my neighbor? Because we're good. We are generally, we meaning human beings, are generally actually pretty good at taking care of the people we acknowledge as our neighbors.
Good point.
Christina, go ahead.
I was just thinking of how, in this particular context, my thought is leaving me here. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost it.
It's okay, we hope you find it. Feel free to bring it back to us if it comes back to you.
When I was in yeshiva 100 years ago, one of the rabbis there talked about the fact that we would have no need for social institutions and governments if each of us took care of our square block or 10 square blocks around us and made sure that the elderly were taken care of and the young were taken care of. And if someone lost their job, we were taking care of them. And so that question about who's our neighbor and how far it could go if we really did try to do something smaller. Because in truth, right now, I feel like my neighbor right now are the women in Afghanistan, right? But what can I do more than like what I did today by sharing the artwork of one of those women, to try to get that message out?
The scripture made a distinction between alien and kin when it came to debts.
Alien, kin, and neighbor. And we've talked about this a little bit in Torah study and a little bit last week. Though ger falls on the side of kin, right? A stranger dwelling among you has the privileges of your kinfolk and your neighbors. And there is a class of people from out of town who are just passing through, who are not invested in your society, that you're not as obligated to. And some of us feel very uncomfortable with that, and some of us feel more comfortable with that. And it's actually, many of you are regulars at Torah study. We're going to be going into this circles of obligation question in some depth in Torah study tomorrow as we look at a very particular excerpt from Kitavo and some of the commentaries on that. But it is a historical fact and a contemporary fact that communities that tend to be less well served by their governments tend to be more close-knit and good at taking care of each other. And that is true of the Jewish community historically. In times when we have been less well served by the governments in the places we have dwelled, we have been more close-knit and better at taking care of each other. And it is also a truth that the more historical and contemporary truth that the more affluent people are, especially if they are not embedded in a particular community of accountability, the more they tend to opt out of mutual aid and mutual, interdependence. Go ahead, Jade.
I was just going to say that, people say Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, but really it's the land of 10,000 taxes. And everything there has so much tax and so much income that the county does everything that anybody needs. And there is not this interdependence. One of the most wonderful, refreshing things about Oregon is that you don't turn to Lane County every time there's any problem. The neighbors help each other out. And just even in this country, it's a dramatic difference. And it's every day my bonds with other people are so real here. And we actually mean something to each other because we know we rely on each other in a way that doesn't happen somewhere else.
That works really well when you and all your neighbors have all the things you need. I think our first class, or maybe it was last class, I think it was Chris asked, well, what about the fact that some regions of Israel are, even in ancient times would have been more productive, would have had plenty of surplus produce, and others were poorer. And there's, various reasons that certain neighborhoods are better resourced. And yes, your neighbors will always help you, but your neighbors might also be in very difficult straits as well. And, how do we, I think Torah is in some ways kind of looking at this question of, both my immediate neighbors, but also my neighbors across town whose neighborhood is less affluent. Like, how do I see myself as accountable to their well-being as well? Yes, Chris.
One of the things that I find particularly depressing about the pandemic is that the more people are not community minded, the worse it gets, or the worse the effects can be. And I just saw a news story tonight on Iceland, and they were interviewing people about what they were doing in vaccinations and everything. And people mentioned civic duty. It was their civic duty to do something. And the newscasters were, isn't that so refreshing? People see, helping each other as a civic duty. And it seems so basic, but that, it's also striking that when people don't feel that connection with each other and want to be so individual, that's when, so it's sort of in real time, we're seeing sort of, I think, what did you call the anti-Shmita, and that's sort of what we're seeing. So that's one of the, you see a really good example of what happens when people are not community minded.
Yeah. And, our society wasn't always this way. When you read about the sacrifices people made, Americans made on the home front fighting World War II and understood to be part of patriotism, patriotism at one point in this country meant sacrifice. Now it seems to me no one can tell me what to do or make any demands on me, but we should and should name that as a historical sick aberration from what love of country and love of community should mean. There is another aspect of Shmita, though, that Christina has remembered what she wanted to say.
Well, kind of. I was going to say the one thing that also strikes me about the difference between what we're reading about the Shmita and our current kind of condition is there's so much more judgment now about why people are poor. What did they do to get poor? Why are they lazy? Do they have mental, why? Rather than the idea in Jewish culture is a certain portion of the society ends up inevitably being poor because of our social systems. And then we need to kind of put something into action to keep correcting this every so many years. But this poor the victim, it's really like another form of victim blaming. Is we assume that these people don't have homes, they're houseless because they've maybe done something morally wrong, or maybe it's justification, whatever it is that's kind of in the back of our society. There's definitely this idea that these people somehow maybe deserve their fate.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If that's not too strong to say that, but it feels that way in our current society. That there's kind of this pulling back from why should I help these people? They probably deserve to do. I'm working so hard and I'm holding it in,
and that is theologically based. I mean, there are certain mainstream dominant theologies based on certain strands of Protestantism that suggest, a prosperity theology, that those who are saved are wealthy and those who are damned are poor, and it is very not Jewish.
Right, yeah.
And I would. So I know our time is running short and it makes me really sad, but I do want to, so I think we've thought much about the implications on Shmita for sort of our responsibilities to the other and the othered. I do want to just close us with just a thought about what this means for ourselves and our own rewilding during this time. Evan Eisenberg, I included a quote from him that we didn't wind up looking at in last week's source sheet, but he sort of riffs on Rabbi Arthur Waskow's piece. And, he has a book, Ecology of Eden. It's a wonderful book. And he talks about the importance of wildness and of, wildness being allowed to infiltrate into our lives so that we have big pockets of wildness like national parks and nature preserves, but also little pockets of wildness in our backyards and hedgerows. And he compares it to the cycles of, Shmita and Jubilee are a big pocket of wildness and time, but like Shabbat, we need to have a little pocket of wildness each week. And then an even littler pocket of wildness when we sleep every night, the ways that we allow ourselves to be wild. I'm going to play a song for you. It's not my song and I can't take credit for even finding the song. I found a link to it I was looking at other teachers' source sheets on Shmita, and I believe this was Rabbi Wolkenfeld from Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel in Chicago had prepared a source sheet that linked to this song. So we're going to watch this song. I think it'll be fun. It's a little, from a particular cisgendered male perspective. But, we can breathe with that. And I think the point can speak to us all. And I just invite you take it in and appreciate it for whatever you can get out of it.
זלמן הסתובב בעולם מבולבל, שאל את עצמו מי אני ובכלל. אני חקלאי, יש לי שטח גדול, ואני מנהל את הכל. אני מגדל פירות וירקות, מקפיד לדשן, לעבד, להשקות. אני המושל על חלקת אדמה, ואז יצאה בת קול ואמרה, זלמן זה לא אתה, הנה תראה שנת שמיטה, השדה מלבלב בלי עזרתך, אתה לא אדמתך, אתה פשוט. זלמן התקשר לכאן ולכאן, אמר לעצמו אני הבוס של הזמן, אני רק מרים איזה טלפון קטן ומיד מסודר העניין. יש לי מעמד מסביב לשעון, קריירה נונסטופ, מניות וממון, אני תמיד זמין לכל הפתעה. והופ יצאה בת קול ואמרה, זלמן זה לא אתה, הנה שבת המלכה, עכשיו תהיה במנוחה, אתה אחד מהעם שאומר תפילה, מעמדך לא אתה, אדמתך לא אתה, אתה פשוט זלמן. ביט באשתו הטובה, כאילן מגונן היא פורסת צילה, שנים אני איתה, אני בעלה, ועדיין כפיות במיטה. הקמנו ביחד משפחה למופת, ויש את חי, סקסית באמת, ואני מי אני בעלה, ואז יצאה בת קול ואמרה, זלמן זה לא אתה, האישה שאיתך היא לא באמת שלך, אשתך עכשיו שומרת נידה, אז טעית בכל קנה מידה, אתה לא בעלה, אתה לא מעמדך, אתה לא אדמתך, אתה פשוט. זלמן נשכב על הכורסה בסלון, הרביט על הקירות, הציץ מהחלון, ביתי מבצרי הוא כמו ממלכה, ושוב יצאה בת קול ואמרה, לא, 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 זלמן זה לא אתה, סוכות עכשיו צא לסוכה, נו בוריש אל תהיה לי מצוברח, הבט לכוכבים הקורצים מהסכך, ביתך לא אתה, אשתך לא אתה, מעמדך לא אתה, גם אדמתך לא אתה, אתה פשוט זלמן. זלמן שאל את אביו החולה, איך אגדיר את עצמי בעולם הזה? אתה בן שלי, אמר האב החכם, ועצם את עיניו לעולם. האבא נטמן בחלקת אדמתו, לנכדו קלמן נתנו את שמו, וזלמן נשאר עם אותה שאלה, ויצתה בת כל הפעם עם תשובה. זלמן אתה זה ששואל, זה שתמיד מתבלבל, בין מה ששלך למי אתה, ובין עבודתך למהות עולמך. זלמן זה לא אתה, מתי כבר תכונן יחסים עם עצמך, אתה לא רכושך, לא הצלחה, אתה לא סביבתך, אפילו לא שאלתך, אתה פשוט זלמן.
Wonderful. I think this is what we were talking, Tom and I were talking about in our breakout room, in that quotation about technology and taking a break and going sitting in the desert or by the river or by the ocean or in the forest and just taking a break, find out who you really are before you create the next bit of technology. Zalman, that's who you are.
I thought this was good in the month of Elul too. As you look at Elul, it's just like you're asking a question, well, who are you? What is your identity? And so, I don't know. I've been asking that myself, actually.
You're Ron. Okay.
Patty, I saw you unmute. Did you want to say something?
No, I was going to tell Ron he needed a melody to go with. You're just wrong.
La 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 la.
Well, friends, I want to bless you that you take some Shmita consciousness from Elul into this new year. Whether that's, by which I think I mean some space to allow yourself to be wild and undefined by the metrics of self-definition from the 6 days of work in the work week and the 6 years of work in the Shmita cycle, and that you have some space to be something wild and unproductive by conventional standards, and that with whatever abundance you have in your life, whether of time or money or pear jam, you use some of that abundance to help other people have space to be wild and free in this year. And may it be so.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Rabbi Kulam.
Thank you, everyone.